The night they tried to erase her, nobody moved a muscle. Crime lord Adrian Vosanello stripped the crystal glass from Seraphina Vale's place at the table, the woman who had held his empire together for 15 years, and handed it to his mistress like it meant nothing. In front of every capo, every lieutenant, every man who owed his freedom to Seraphina's quiet brilliance, he told the room she was the new symbol of the family, and then the silence came. Not a single glass was lifted. Not one. And in that silence, Adrian Vosanello learned the most expensive lesson of his life. That the most dangerous person he would ever face was the woman he had just humiliated. If this story already has your attention, drop a like and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The estate had been in the Vosanello family for 61 years, and in all that time, the marble floors had never once felt cold. That was what Seraphina Vale told herself the first winter she'd walked those halls. That the stone absorbed the warmth of everyone who'd crossed it, held it somewhere deep in the rock the way old buildings hold old arguments. By the time she understood the truth, she had already given the place 15 years of her own heat. Tonight, the chandeliers above the main dining hall burned at full capacity. 42 candles, real ones, not electric, because Adrian believed electricity was for office buildings, and Adrian believed many things that were mostly about appearances, threw amber light across the faces of 23 men seated along the length of a table that had been custom-built to intimidate. Seraphina had supervised the installation herself. She had measured the proportions to ensure that whoever sat at the center could be seen by everyone without effort. It was a small detail. It was the kind of detail that decided whether a meeting felt like a summit or felt like a tribunal. She was 44 years old, and she sat at Adrian's right hand the way she had for a decade and a half. Not because he'd ever formally given her that position, but because the men in the room had learned early on that whatever Seraphina said in that chair carried the same finality as whatever Adrian said from his own. That was not an accident. It had taken years of precise, careful, unglamorous work to build that kind of weight into a presence. You didn't earn it by being loud. You earned it by being right, repeatedly, in situations where being wrong would have cost someone their life. The room smelled like roasted lamb, and the particular brand of Italian wine that Adrian imported at obscene expense and served at every formal dinner regardless of whether it suited the season. In January, it never did, but no one mentioned it. That was also part of the structure of things. Seraphina had eaten 3 bites of her meal. Not because the food was poor. Emilio, the estate's head cook, had been producing meals of genuine quality for 12 years, but because she had learned long ago that full dinners made her slower in the hours that mattered, and the hours after the formal toast always mattered. People loosened. People said things they wouldn't say with their guards fully in place. She needed to be present for every syllable of that. Adrian was in the middle of a story about a negotiation from the previous autumn. It wasn't a particularly compelling story. It was the 3rd time he'd told a version of it at a formal dinner, and the details changed slightly each time, tilting a little more in his favor with each retelling. Seraphina had stopped tracking the inaccuracies. That wasn't her job. Her job was to watch the faces of the men listening and note which ones were good enough actors to look engaged. Marco Ferri, seated 4 chairs down on the left, was looking at his glass. He'd been looking at it for the better part of 6 minutes. That was worth filing away. Dante Ashworth, who controlled the port operations and whose goodwill was worth approximately $3 million a month in undisturbed logistics, was nodding along to Adrian's story with the specific rhythm of a man who has made nodding automatic, so his mind can be somewhere else entirely. Also worth noting, the man at the far end of the table, Luca Vieri, the youngest in the room at 31, who handled the northern corridor and who Seraphina had personally vouched for when Adrian had doubts 2 years ago, was watching her. Not Adrian. Her. When her eyes found his, he looked back at his plate immediately. She felt the small wrongness of that without being able to name its shape yet. Adrian finished his story. The room produced the expected laughter. Some genuine, some performed, arranged in the appropriate ratio for a room full of men who were afraid to be caught, either too enthusiastic or too reserved. He picked up his wine glass and turned it slowly in his fingers, which was the gesture he used when he was about to transition into something he'd prepared. Seraphina recognized it the way she recognized his breathing patterns, his posture shifts, the specific set of his jaw when he was performing confidence versus when he actually felt it. She recognized in this moment that what she was seeing was performance. "Before the toast," Adrian said, letting the table settle into attention, "I want to mark something." The conversations at the edges of the table quieted. 23 men oriented themselves toward him. This family has carried a certain tradition for a long time. The toast has always been given by the same hand. He set his glass down and turned to look at her. Seraphina met his eyes. The expression on his face was not unkind. That was the thing she would remember later, in the hours when she replayed it. The expression was almost gentle, in the way that a man's face can look gentle when he is doing something he has convinced himself is reasonable. It was the face of a person delivering news he believes is good news, from a position so elevated he can't tell the difference anymore. "But traditions need to breathe," he said. "They need to grow." He reached across the table. He lifted the crystal glass from her place setting. The sound it made, the small, clean scrape of crystal against linen, was the loudest thing Seraphina had ever heard in her life. It hit her somewhere in the sternum, not like a blow, but like the drop in pressure before a storm arrives. The room felt it. She could tell by the stillness that fell, the way even the breathing in the room seemed to pause and reconsider. Adrian turned and held the glass out toward Celeste Rowan. Celeste was 29. She had dark hair that she wore deliberately loose, and she had a quality of attention that felt like warmth until you understood it was strategic. She was not unintelligent. Seraphina had never made the mistake of thinking that. But she was 29, and she had been Adrian's companion for 8 months, and she had never once been in a room when a decision with actual consequences was made. The glass in her direction was not a promotion. It was a costume. "Celeste will deliver the family toast tonight," Adrian said, as the new symbol of the family's loyalty and direction. He said it like he was giving a gift. He watched the room the way a man watches an audience when he believes he has landed something impressive. Celeste took the glass. Her fingers were steady. She had better composure than most people gave her credit for. She looked at the table with an expression that was trying to project confidence and landed somewhere in the neighborhood of careful. Seraphina did not look at Adrian. She looked at the table, 23 men, the ones she'd negotiated beside, the ones she'd talked out of catastrophic decisions at 2 a.m, the ones whose families she'd sent money to when situations got complicated, the ones whose silence she'd bought and whose trust she'd earned in small increments over 15 years of being the person in the room who actually did the work. Not one of them raised their glass. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't coordinated. There was no signal passed between them, no exchanged glance, no deliberate act of solidarity. It was simply the spontaneous expression of an instinct that every man in that room possessed, which was the instinct towards self-preservation. And every one of them understood, in some wordless register, that the glass in Celeste Rowan's hand was not authority. It was a prop. And raising a drink to a prop in a room full of men who had survived by reading the difference between substance and theater was the kind of mistake that stayed with you. The silence stretched. Adrian's expression moved through several phases. Surprise first, then something that looked like confusion, the expression of a man certain enough in his own judgment that contradiction feels less like new information and more like malfunction. Then something tighter, a drawing inward, a narrowing around the eyes. Seraphina rose from her chair. She did not push it back dramatically. She did not throw anything. She stood up with the same economy of movement she brought to everything, the way she'd always moved, efficiently, without performance, as though her body understood that attention should be earned by what you do, not by how you do it. She looked at Adrian once, long enough for him to understand she was not leaving in anger. She was leaving because she had decided to. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice even and clear, "thank you for your hospitality, as always." She picked up her own coat from the back of her chair. She'd hung it there herself because she never trusted anyone else to know where her things were, and she walked toward the door. Nobody stopped her. Nobody spoke. She heard Adrian say her name once, with a particular sharpness that was less her name and more a command disguised as her name. She kept walking. Her heels crossed the marble when that same marble she'd told herself held warmth. And then she pushed through the door into the January night, and the cold came at her immediately and without apology, and she thought, there it is. That's what the stone feels like when you've given it everything it was going to take from you. Behind her, through the closed door, she could hear the dining room beginning to breathe again. The sound of careful conversations restarting. The sound of a room trying to recover. She did not go back to hear whether any glasses were raised. She already knew they hadn't been. Sam. She drove herself. She always had. Adrian had offered her a driver years ago, and she'd accepted for exactly 2 months before deciding that the 12 minutes between the estate and her own residence were the only minutes of any given day that belonged entirely to her, and she wasn't willing to give them to someone else's steering wheel. The car was a dark gray sedan, practical, forgettable, deliberately chosen. In her world, forgettable was a form of armor. The streets were empty in the way January streets get empty in this city after midnight. Not abandoned, but stripped of everything casual, leaving only the people with somewhere they had to be. She drove without music. She had always processed in silence. Her hands on the wheel were steady, and she watched that steadiness with a detachment that she recognized as the same thing that had carried her through 15 years of being the one who stayed calm in rooms where everything was falling apart. She was not calm right now, but she was functioning, which was close enough. The house she kept was modest by the standards of the people she worked with. 3 bedrooms, a study, a garden that looked better in warmer months, a kitchen she actually used. It had taken her 6 years of careful financial management to own it outright, and she had never told Adrian it was fully paid for because she understood intuitively that people who held debts over you, even informally, always preferred you to have at least one outstanding. The house was the one thing she'd kept completely separate from the architecture of the organization. She sat in the car in the driveway for a while. Not because she didn't know what she was going to do. She had known what she was going to do approximately 90 seconds into the dinner, from the moment she'd read the particular quality of Adrian's prepared expression and understood that something had been decided in a room she hadn't been invited to. What she was doing in the driveway was letting herself finish feeling what she was feeling before she put it somewhere manageable. Seraphina Vale was not a person who denied herself the reality of her own emotions. She simply refused to let them occupy the driver's seat. She felt, right now, a specific clean variety of grief. Not the complicated kind, Bob. Not the kind tangled up with love or longing or the wish that things had been different. The clean kind. The kind that comes when something you built with your own hands gets used as a stepping stone by someone who never understood what it cost to lay the foundation. She'd given that organization 15 years. Not in the romantic way people sometimes described loyalty to institutions. Not in the way that erased the hard parts or dressed them up in nobility they didn't deserve. She knew what the organization was. She'd never needed it to be something else. She had made her choices with full knowledge of what she was choosing, and she'd built something inside that structure that was genuinely worth building, a network of relationships so deep and functional that the whole machine ran on it whether anyone acknowledged it or not. And Adrian had handed that network symbol to a woman who didn't know its name. Inside the house, she turned on the kitchen light and put water on for tea. Not because she wanted tea, but because having something to do with her hands was useful when your mind was processing. And she stood at the counter and thought about what came next. She thought about Marco Ferri looking at his glass. She thought about Dante Ashworth's automatic nod. She thought about Luca Vieri looking at her and then looking away. She thought about 23 men who had not raised a single glass. Adrian would spend the next week telling himself it was sentiment, that the capos were reacting emotionally to a familiar face being replaced, that the market logic was still sound, that the operations would continue, that loyalty in this business was ultimately transactional, and transactions could be renegotiated. He would believe this because he had always understood the organization through its mechanisms, the money flows, the territory agreements, the threat structures, without ever fully grasping what held the mechanisms in place. What held them in place was her. Not because she was indispensable, nobody was indispensable, but because the web of relationships she had spent 15 years building, the promises she'd kept when it would have been easier to let them expire, the favors she'd extended without requiring immediate return, The information she'd protected when exposing it would have been politically useful. The exact careful way she'd managed the ego of every significant man in that room so that each of them felt seen without ever feeling challenged. That web was not a thing that transferred. It was not a document or a contact list or a series of accounts. It was a living structure, and it had been built around her specifically. And without her at its center, it would begin to collapse in ways so quiet and so distributed that Adrian wouldn't even understand it was happening until the damage was irreversible. She knew this with complete certainty. She poured the tea she didn't want and took it to the study and opened the top drawer of her desk, where she kept a single notebook. Handwritten, nothing digital, nothing that could be accessed without her physical presence. And she began to write. Not a plan, exactly. A list of things she wanted to be clear about before she did anything else. The list began. What I will not do. She would not contact Adrian first. She would not apologize. She would not offer to return on the terms he would inevitably propose, which would be terms that restored her function without restoring her standing, because that was the only kind of return he was capable of imagining right now. She would not contact the capos. She would not orchestrate anything. She would not make calls or send messages or activate any part of the network she'd built in service of any agenda. If the network responded to her departure the way she understood it would do so on its own logic, according to the 1,000 small commitments and dependencies she had established over 15 years. She had not built it as a weapon. She would not use it as one now. She would wait. She had learned patience the hard way, in the early years of the organization when Adrian had still been his father's protege, and she had been a 29-year-old with sharp instincts and no institutional standing, doing necessary work for an organization that did not yet know what to do with someone like her. She had waited then. She knew how to do it. She knew what it looked like from the outside, passive, defeated, powerless. And she knew what it felt like from the inside, which was more like a current than a stillness. The potential energy of a person who knows what's coming. She closed the notebook. She drank half the tea. She went to bed at 1:47 in the morning and she slept. Not easily, not all the way through, but genuinely, because she was too disciplined to give insomnia anything useful to work with, and because somewhere underneath the grief and the cold clarity, there was something that felt uncomfortably, almost like relief. By 6 a.m., she had 3 missed calls from numbers she recognized. By 8 a.m., there were 11. By noon, her phone had accumulated 27 contact attempts. Not from Adrian, not yet, but from men whose names were woven through the fabric of everything the Vosanello organization touched. Men who, 24 hours earlier, had sat at that table and not raised a glass. She did not answer. She made breakfast, eggs, toast, the routine precision of making something ordinary, and she sat at the table she'd eaten 1,000 quiet mornings at, and thought about a man named Carver Doyle. Carver Doyle ran import logistics for the Eastern sector, which meant that approximately 40% of the organization's incoming supply chain moved through his operation. He was 57, he had a persistent bad knee from an incident 15 years back that he never talked about, and he had a son named Patrick who was 22 and had recently begun working in the organization's legitimate construction arm. 3 years ago, when Patrick had made an error in judgment that could have cost the family a significant contract and cost Patrick a great deal more, it was Seraphina who had quietly restructured the situation, absorbing the cost on the books in a way that protected the contract and kept Patrick's involvement invisible to the people who would have found it most useful to know about it. She had never mentioned it to Carver directly. She didn't need to. Carver had not raised his glass last night. She thought about Elena Voss, who was not in the organization but whose husband ran the city's primary real estate management company, through which approximately $200 million in organizational assets were currently structured. Elena Voss was 61 and had lupus and had, 18 months ago, needed a specific specialist in Geneva whom nobody in her circle knew how to reach on short notice. Seraphina had reached him. She had done it because she had been asked by a mutual contact, and because the cost to her was 3 phone calls, and because Elena Voss had subsequently understood, without anything explicit being said, that the woman who held Adrian Vosanello's right-hand position was someone worth remaining on good terms with. Seraphina had never collected on any of it. She had just let it sit there, All of it, the thousand small acts of careful relationship management, like deposits in an account she never expected to draw from. Not because she was naive, because she understood that the value of a thing you never use is that everyone knows you could use it if you chose to. Her phone rang again. She looked at the screen. The number was one she'd assigned no contact name in her phone because she had a private system for the numbers that mattered most, a system that didn't depend on saved contacts. She knew whose number it was because she had memorized it 8 years ago when the man it belonged to had done something that had changed the balance of power in the organization so significantly that Seraphina had understood immediately he was either an asset or an existential problem. She had made him an asset. His name was Gregor Holst, and he controlled 6 of the city's 9 primary transit corridors. And he was calling her at 12:17 on the first day after she'd walked out of Adrian Vosanello's dining room. She let it ring. She watched it ring. She put the phone face down on the table and finished her toast and looked out the window at the garden where the January bare branches of the apple tree she'd planted 4 years ago were doing their motionless thing in the cold air. And she thought about what it meant that Gregor Holst was calling her at 12:17 on day 1. It meant things were already moving faster than even she had expected. She had given the organization 15 years, and the organization had shown her, in the space of about 12 hours, that it knew exactly who it belonged to. The phone stopped ringing. Then, after a pause of about 40 seconds, it started again. Same number. She turned the phone back over, looked at it, let out a breath that was slow and deliberate, and the kind of breath you take when you are measuring the distance between what you could do and what you've decided to do, and making sure the measurement is right before you commit to it. She picked up. "Gregor," she said. There was a pause on the other end. Then his voice, which was low and careful and carried the specific texture of a man who was choosing each word like he was crossing ice. The Eastern transit routes were supposed to open this morning. They didn't. "I know. The authorization codes Celeste tried to put through weren't accepted. I know that too." Another pause. "Are you behind it?" "No," Seraphina said. It was the truth. She hadn't touched anything. She hadn't made a single call. The codes weren't accepted because the people who ran the systems that accepted them had made their own calculations and had decided, independently, to wait. "I'm not behind anything, Gregor. I'm sitting in my kitchen." "Then what do we do?" She looked at the apple tree. "You wait," she said. "You let the system tell you what it needs. And then you call me again." She ended the call. She sat for a long time after that, in the silence of her kitchen, with the cold January light coming through the window at an angle that made the whole room feel like the pause before something significant. And she thought about Adrian Vosanello waking up this morning, moving through his estate, beginning to feel the first edges of what was happening, the first indication that the collapse she'd spent 15 years quietly preventing was now proceeding without her intervention to stop it. She thought about what he would do. She thought about how long it would take him to understand what it was he was actually dealing with. She thought about Celeste Rowan, standing in a role she hadn't asked for and didn't fully understand, holding a crystal glass that nobody had raised, and she felt something for the woman that was not quite sympathy, but was close enough to it to be uncomfortable. Celeste was not the problem. Celeste had been used the same way Adrian used everything, as an instrument of an image he was constructing without understanding that the image had already cost him the foundation it was supposed to stand on. Seraphina made a second cup of tea. She didn't drink that one either. But around 3 p.m., as the light in the kitchen shifted and the apple tree outside moved slightly in a wind she couldn't hear through the glass, her phone showed a text from a number she absolutely had not expected. The text contained 4 words. She read them. She read them again. And for the first time since she had walked out of Adrian Vosanello's dining room, with the sound of an empty room at her back, Seraphina Vale felt something shift in the architecture of everything. A movement so quiet and so significant that it changed the shape of whatever came next in ways she had not, in 15 years of careful preparation, fully anticipated. She set the phone down slowly, looked at the ceiling, and thought, so it begins. The 4 words on the screen were, "He doesn't know yet." No signature, no follow-up, just those 4 words from a number she'd saved under no name in her phone, a number that belonged to a man named Sal Marin, who was officially Adrian Vosanello's head of internal security and who had, unofficially, been feeding Seraphina low-level operational intelligence for 6 years in exchange for her quiet protection of an arrangement he had with a competing logistics family that Adrian would have burned him alive for if he'd ever found out. She had never used the information Sal passed her against Adrian. She had never needed to. But Sal was texting her at 3 p.m. on day 1, which meant that whatever was happening inside the estate had already passed the point where the people closest to Adrian felt safe keeping their heads down and their loyalties undivided. Sal Marin was a man who didn't reach out unless the weather inside those walls had gotten genuinely dangerous. And he doesn't know yet meant that Adrian was still operating on yesterday's understanding of the situation. Still convinced that the silence at the dinner table was sentiment, nostalgia, old men reluctant to see a familiar face displaced. He didn't know yet that Gregor Halst's transit routes had frozen. He didn't know yet what that meant. Seraphina turned the phone face down again and left it there, and went to the study and sat with her notebook and thought very carefully about what she was going to do with that information. Because doing nothing with it was a choice. Doing something with it was a different choice. And the distance between those two positions was exactly the distance between a woman who had walked away cleanly and a woman who was still, in some structural sense, embedded in the machine she'd left. She decided to do nothing. She wrote that down, do nothing. Let it move on its own. Then she closed the notebook, changed her shoes to something more practical, and went out into the garden in the January cold and spent 40 minutes cutting back the dead growth on the apple tree with a pair of pruning shears she kept in the shed because she had always found that physical work gave her mind the conditions it needed to arrive at things it couldn't reach sitting still. By the time she came back inside, her hands were numb and her thinking was clear. Look them. Adrian Vosanello did not sleep well. He would not have admitted this to anyone because admitting it would have meant admitting that the previous evening had affected him, and admitting it had affected him would have meant confronting the specific quality of what he'd felt when 23 men had declined to raise their glasses, which was not, as he'd told himself in the first hour after Seraphina left, simple sentimentality from old loyalists, but was something that felt, when he let himself get close enough to it in the dark of 3 a.m., much more like a verdict. He got up at 5. He had coffee in the kitchen, the main kitchen, not the formal dining room kitchen, the one that Emilio used for the household staff's meals, because the formal dining room still had the long table with the settings from last night on it, and he hadn't yet told anyone to clear it. Some superstition he wouldn't name, even to himself, had kept him from giving that instruction. Celeste was still asleep. He appreciated that about her, on some mornings, her capacity to be elsewhere when he needed to think. On other mornings, that same absence felt like a gap where something else should be. He recognized that this was an ungenerous thought and set it aside. He called his operations manager, a man named Felix Druart, at 5:47 a.m. Felix answered on the second ring, which told Adrian that Felix had also not been sleeping. "Talk to me," Adrian said. A pause on the other end that lasted approximately 1 beat too long. "The Halst routes are showing hold status." Adrian set down his coffee cup. Meaning what, specifically? Meaning the authorization push that went through last night, the new access credentials. They're not being processed. Technical issue? Another pause. Felix Druart was 53 years old and had worked organizational operations for 19 years, and he was a man who dealt in precision. Not because he was brave, but because he understood that imprecision in his position cost him more than honesty did. "I don't think it's technical." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Halst." He's not refusing. Officially. His people are citing a processing delay, requesting clarification on the new authorization chain. What clarification? The chain is clear. Celeste signs off on the Eastern Corridor sign-offs as of last night. That's the new structure. Silence. Adrian understood the silence. He understood it the way you understand a locked door. Not from seeing what's behind it, but from the resistance when you push. "Tell Halst I want a call. Noon." "Yes," Felix said, and then quietly, "There's something else. Go." The Voss property accounts. The quarterly review meeting that was scheduled for Wednesday. Elena Voss's office called this morning to reschedule. They're citing a scheduling conflict. To when? They didn't specify. Adrian's hand tightened around the phone. What does Seraphina... He stopped himself. The sentence had started before his brain caught up to the fact that it was no longer a sentence he could finish. He stood in the kitchen with the cold morning pressing against the windows and felt for the first time the specific shape of what he'd done. Not abstractly, concretely. The first two data points of a pattern he did not want to be a pattern. Felix? He said. Yes. Find out who Seraphina has been talking to. Another pause, this one longer. Since last night? Since last night. I'll need some time. You have until noon. He ended the call and stood in the kitchen for a long moment, his hand still holding the phone, the coffee going cold beside him, and thought about Seraphina's face when he'd reached across and taken the glass. The expression on her face had not been what he'd expected. He'd expected, not tears, she wasn't built for tears in public, he knew that, but something. Some visible wound. Some flash of the thing he'd taken from her. Instead, she'd looked at him with an expression he couldn't decode, and he still couldn't decode it now, and that bothered him more than any of the rest of it. Celeste came downstairs at 8 in a robe she'd brought from her own apartment, pale blue silk that looked out of place in the estate's kitchen, the same way she still, 8 months in, sometimes looked out of place inside the life she'd been given. She poured herself coffee and watched Adrian across the kitchen island with a quality of attention that he'd noticed early on and found compelling. The way she watched things, the way a person watches things, when they know they're not seeing the whole picture. You've been up for hours, she said. Couldn't sleep. She nodded slowly, set down her cup. The roots. He looked at her. You know about the roots. Felix called me at 6:30. He didn't know whether he should call you first or me, so he called both. That was something Adrian needed to address. The question of chain of command, of who occupied what position in the new structure, was not something he'd fully articulated because he hadn't fully worked it out himself. He'd made a symbolic gesture last night without fully engineering the infrastructure that the gesture implied. That was he was beginning to understand, not a small omission. It'll resolve, he said. Celeste looked at him with those watching eyes. Will it? The capos are reacting. It's emotional. Old loyalty. Adrian. Her voice was quiet and direct, and he heard something in it that he didn't hear often, which was the specific register of a person who is about to say something they know will cost them. I don't know what Seraphina did or how she did it. I don't know the details of any of the alliances or the arrangements or whatever it is that actually holds this organization together. And I think that's the problem. He looked at her for a long moment. You're saying I put you in a position? I'm saying you put us both in a position, she said carefully, that neither of us fully understands. And the people who are pulling back right now, they understand it. They understand it very well. The honesty of it sat between them, uncomfortable and necessary. What do you want me to do? He asked. I want you to be honest with yourself, she said, about what you thought was going to happen. He didn't answer that. He picked up his coffee and walked out of the kitchen. But the noon call with Gregor Holst lasted 11 minutes and resolved nothing. Holst was a man who had built his position in the organization on an almost architectural patience. He spoke slowly, he agreed readily, he committed to nothing in the specific moment while giving the impression of full cooperation. Adrian had always found this quality useful because it meant Holst could be deployed in situations that required the appearance of alignment without actual risk. Now, on the other side of that same quality, Adrian understood it differently. The authorization structure, Holst said, for the third time in 11 minutes, in the tone of a man with genuine concerns about bureaucratic procedure, needs clarification. My team needs to understand who the signing authority is for operational decisions in the Eastern Corridor. It's a straightforward question. The signing authority is Celeste Rowan, as I stated last night. Of course, I understand that. A pause. My team is asking for documentation, formal documentation establishing the authority chain. You understand, for our records, for the legal side? Gregor. Yes. We have never operated on formal documentation. You know that. We've operated on formal documentation of a kind, Hulse said carefully. The kind that existed in the understanding between specific individuals over a specific period of time. What I'm saying, Adrian, what my team is asking very respectfully, is who, specifically, is the individual now, in that role? In terms of that understanding. Adrian pressed 2 fingers against his forehead. Celeste Rowan. Understood. Another pause. My team will need a bit of time to process the adjustment. The call ended without resolution, which was Hulst's answer, presented in the most deniable form he could construct. Adrian sat in his office, the one on the 2nd floor of the estate, with the window that looked out over the winter garden, and turned a pen over and over in his fingers and thought about the phrase formal documentation. Seraphina had never needed documentation. Not because she'd operated informally. She was, if anything, the most precise person in any room she occupied, and the records she maintained were meticulous, but because the authority she'd exercised had been legible to every person it touched in ways that didn't require paper. It had been legible because it had been real, because it had been earned in encounters that each of those men could specifically remember, in moments when she'd made a difference in their specific situations, and that memory was worth more than any document Adrian could produce. He thought about calling her. He didn't. Instead, he called Felix, who told him that as of noon, he could find no evidence that Seraphina had contacted any member of the organization since walking out the previous evening. No calls, no messages, nothing through any of the channels Felix had access to monitor. Adrian found this deeply unsettling in a way he couldn't immediately explain. She's not doing anything, he said, mostly to himself. No, Felix said. Then why? He stopped, looked at the winter garden, the bare trees out there, the empty beds. She doesn't need to do anything, does she? Felix said nothing, which was also an answer. By the 3rd day, Marco Ferri asked for a meeting. Ferri controlled the financial processing network that moved organizational funds through 11 separate legitimate fronts: restaurants, property management, a small shipping company, a printing business that had been in the Ferri family for 30 years. He was 52 and had a quality of stillness that sometimes read as patience and sometimes read as threat, depending on which direction things were moving. He'd been one of the first men to sit at that table, and he had not raised his glass. He came to the estate on a Thursday afternoon, and Adrian met him in the 2nd floor study, not the formal room, because the formal room still had that quality he couldn't shake loose, the quality of a room where something had happened that hadn't finished happening yet. Ferri sat across from him with his jacket on, which meant he didn't intend to stay. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, not tense, not aggressive, just present, as though he wanted Adrian to be able to see them. I'm going to speak plainly, Ferri said. Please. The processing routes through the Hulst corridor, the ones that are frozen right now, 3 of the fronts under my network depend on those routes for their quarterly clearing cycles. If those routes stay frozen past the end of the month, I have a problem. The routes will open, Adrian said. I'm handling Hulst. I believe you're handling Hulst, Ferri said carefully. What I'm less certain of is the timeline. He paused. There are other arrangements that are also not frozen, exactly, more like pending. Which arrangements? Ferri looked at him steadily. The Doyle arrangement, the understanding with the Voss property accounts, the channel through the northern sector that Seraphina maintained with the Vieri operation. Each name landed in Adrian's chest like something dropped from a height. Those are separate from Hulst, he said. They are. They're pending separately, for different reasons. Ferri's voice stayed level. He wasn't delivering this as a confrontation. He was delivering it the way a doctor delivers test results, with the same quality of factual regret. The common thread is that the relationships behind those arrangements were personal, in a specific way. To Seraphina. Yes. Adrian stood up. Not from anger exactly, from the need to change the geometry of the room, to put himself somewhere other than sitting across from Marco Ferri, while Marco Ferri described the architecture of a disaster in that quiet, precise tone. He walked to the window, The garden again, the bare trees. What are you telling me, Marco? Ferry was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was still level, but something in it had changed. Not harder, but more deliberate, the way you sound when you've made a decision about how much to say and you're following through on it. I'm telling you that this organization has operated for 15 years on a structure that most of us never fully examined because it worked. And when things work, you don't examine them. A pause. It worked because of Seraphina. Not entirely. You've built real things here, Adrian. The territory structure, the enforcement capacity, those are yours. But the part that held the people together, the part that made sure old debts got honored and new alliances didn't blow up in the first year, that was her. Specifically, her. Adrian turned. And now you're telling me you can't work with Celeste. I'm not saying that. Barry met his eyes. I'm saying I don't know Celeste. Nobody in this room knows Celeste. And what this organization runs on, at the level I'm describing, is knowing. The specific, particular, hard-won kind of knowing that comes from 15 years of shared history. He picked up his jacket. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm telling you what I see, because we've worked together long enough that I think you deserve to hear it plainly. He stood up. Marco. Barry paused. If I asked her to come back, Adrian said, and the sentence felt strange in his mouth, the shape of it wrong, too unfamiliar. Would she? Barry looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was not unkind and not without pity. I think that depends on what you asked her to come back to. He left. Adrian stood at the window for a long time after the door closed, listening to the estate around him, which was quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet since he could remember. Not the quiet of a house at rest, but the quiet of a mechanism whose parts have stopped moving in concert. Seraphina was at the market when her phone rang with Luca Vieri's name. She stood in the vegetable aisle of the ordinary grocery store she'd been shopping at for 4 years. Not the specialty market, not the expensive one, the one 3 blocks from her house where she knew the hours and the checkout staff knew her face. And looked at Luca's name on her screen with a basket over her arm containing a butternut squash and a bunch of kale and a pint of something she'd grabbed without looking at. Luca was 31 and ran the Northern Corridor, and she had vouched for him 2 years ago, and he had been looking at her at the dinner and then looking away. She answered. Seraphina. His voice was taut. Not afraid. Luca Vieri was not easily afraid, but compressed, like a person keeping something contained. Luca, I need to meet with you. I'm at the grocery store. A pause. Tonight. She moved to a quieter section of the aisle. Why? Because something is happening with the Northern Corridor that you need to know about. Luca. She kept her voice measured. I'm not in the organization anymore. Whatever's happening in the Northern Corridor is Adrian's concern. That's not... He stopped. She heard him breathe. There's a third party moving into the northern sector. They've been making contact with my people for the past 72 hours. I don't know if Adrian knows. The pint of whatever it was she'd grabbed, strawberries she saw now, felt suddenly heavier in the basket. She thought very carefully about what she was about to say, because this was a hinge point, a moment where the direction she chose would determine the shape of the next several weeks, possibly longer. How long has this been building? Before last night. That's why I couldn't look at you at the dinner. I'd been getting the first contact signals for about a week, and I didn't know what to do with them. And then you... What happened, and I... Who is it? His voice dropped lower. Cassian Moore. The name landed in her chest like cold water. Cassian Moore was not a name she said out loud often. He ran the rival network from the south, not a direct competitor in most sectors because the territories had been divided by an agreement negotiated 8 years ago. A negotiation that Seraphina had personally managed across 6 weeks of careful back-channel work. The agreement had held because both sides had understood the cost of violating it. Cassian Moore, moving into the Northern Corridor 72 hours after the Vosanello organization's internal structure had publicly cracked at a dinner party, was not a coincidence. Does Adrian know? She said. I don't think so. She thought about the text from Sal Marin. He doesn't know yet. This was what Sal had meant. "Why are you calling me and not Adrian?" she said, though she thought she already knew. Luca's voice was quiet and direct. "Because Adrian doesn't have anyone right now who can handle Cassian Moore, and because you're the one who made the original agreement with him, and because if Moore gets traction in the north, Adrian's organization doesn't survive the year." A pause. "And because I think you know all of this already." She stood in the produce aisle of an ordinary grocery store on an ordinary Thursday afternoon with strawberries in her basket and thought about the apple tree in her garden and the notebook in her desk and the list that began, "What I will not do." She had not anticipated this. She had understood that the organization would begin to destabilize. She had understood that Adrian would face consequences for what he'd done. She had understood that her absence would reveal the load-bearing nature of everything she'd built. She had not fully accounted for the possibility that a predator with excellent timing would read the exact moment of structural weakness and move. Cassian Moore was not a man who moved slowly. "I'll call you back in an hour," she said to Luca. She ended the call. She stood very still in the produce aisle for a moment, her hand around the phone, feeling the specific quality of a situation that has just changed shape, that has moved from the category of consequence into the category of crisis. And she thought about what that meant for the decision she had written down in her notebook. Do nothing. Let it move on its own. The problem with that instruction, she understood now, was that it had been written before she knew Cassian Moore was already moving. She put the strawberries back on the shelf. She did not put back the squash or the kale. She went through the checkout line and paid in cash and carried her bags to the car and drove home, and by the time she pulled into the driveway, her mind had arranged the situation into its actual shape. This was no longer a story about one man's pride and one woman's departure. This was a story about whether an organization that had served as a stabilizing structure in this city's particular ecosystem of power was going to survive the next 30 days. And Seraphina Vale had spent 15 years making sure that structure survived. Not because she loved it without qualification, and not because she owed it unconditional loyalty, but because she understood, with the same precision she brought to everything, that the alternatives to it were worse. She sat in the car. She thought about calling Adrian. She didn't. She called a different number instead, one she had not called in 8 years, a number that she had memorized the way she memorized all important numbers, stored in her own mind rather than any device, because some contact information was too significant to risk losing to a phone upgrade or a compromised system. It rang twice. Then Cassian Moore picked up. His voice was smooth and unhurried and carried the particular quality of a man who had been expecting this call for several days. "Seraphina, I was wondering when you'd reach out." She looked at the bare branches of the apple tree through the windshield. "You're moving too fast," she said. "Am I?" he said, not a question. "You're reading the situation wrong." "Help me read it right then." A pause, and in the pause she heard the specific weight of what he was actually proposing. Not a conversation, not a negotiation, but an invitation. An opening she hadn't created and hadn't asked for, and couldn't now pretend wasn't there. "This is not an offer I'm making," she said carefully. "Of course not," Moore said. "You've never made an offer in your life, Seraphina. You've only ever asked questions." Another pause. "So ask your question." She pressed her hand flat against the steering wheel, feeling the cold leather, feeling the ground-level reality of where she was, what she was doing, who she was choosing to call. "If I asked you to hold your position in the north for 30 days, she said, "what would you want for it?" The silence on Cassian Moore's end lasted long enough that she could hear him breathing, slow and deliberate, the breathing of a man who had the patience to wait for a sentence to finish before he decided what it meant. "That," he said finally, "is a very interesting question coming from a woman who just walked out of the Vosanello organization." "I know what it is," she said. "Then you know what it implies." She did. It implied that whatever she was about to negotiate, she was negotiating without Adrian's knowledge, without his authorization, and, if Adrian ever found out, in a way he could only interpret as a separate play, a separate agenda, a betrayal of the kind that the organization did not forgive. It also implied that if she didn't make this call, Cassian Moore would own the Northern Corridor inside of 30 days, And whatever Adrian chose to do or not do in response to her departure would be rendered irrelevant by a territorial shift that the entire organization would spend the next decade trying to recover from. There was no version of this where she had clean hands. There was only the version where the damage was contained and the version where it wasn't. 30 days, Moore said slowly, tasting the proposition. And what exactly would you be doing with 30 days, Seraphina? She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, opened them. I'd be reminding someone, she said, of what they forgot. Moore was quiet for a moment, then, I want the River District processing agreements reviewed. The terms from 8 years ago don't reflect current volume. I'll listen to what you propose. That's all I ask. She ended the call and sat in the car and understood with complete clarity that she had just crossed a line she had told herself she would not cross, that in picking up the phone and calling Cassian Moore directly, without telling Adrian, without telling anyone, she had made herself something she hadn't been 20 minutes ago when she was standing in a grocery store with strawberries in a basket. She had made herself a player. And players, in the world she'd spent 15 years navigating, did not get to stay clean. Her phone buzzed. Text from Sal Marin. He knows about Moore. Felix told him an hour ago. He's on his way to your house. She looked up through the windshield. At the end of her driveway, a pair of headlights turned in from the street and came to a stop behind her car, and she recognized the vehicle. Black, low, the particular model Adrian had driven for 6 years. And she understood that the 30 days she'd just asked Cassian Moore to hold his position for had just collapsed into whatever the next 10 minutes were going to be. She did not get out of the car. Adrian did not get out of his. They sat like that for what felt like a long time, but was probably 40 seconds. 2 vehicles in a narrow driveway, headlights off now on his end, the January dark pressing down on both of them, the house behind her with its kitchen light on and its apple tree visible at the side in the dim glow from the neighbor's property. Seraphina watched his silhouette through the windshields and thought about the phone in her hand and the call she'd just made and the specific, irreversible quality of things that have already been done. Then his door opened. She got out too, because staying in the car would have been a posture, and she didn't have the patience for postures right now. The cold came at her immediately. She hadn't brought her coat from the front seat. She didn't go back for it. Adrian looked worse than she'd expected. Not physically damaged. He was still Adrian, still the particular brand of composed that a lifetime of being the most dangerous person in most rooms will build into a man's bearing. But there was something around his eyes that she hadn't seen before, or hadn't seen in a long time. A quality of sleeplessness that went deeper than one bad night. He was wearing a dark coat, no tie, and his hands were in his pockets, which was something he did when he was keeping them still deliberately. They stood in the driveway with 8 feet of cold air between them. You called Moore, he said. Not an accusation. A fact, delivered in the tone of a man who is still deciding what the fact means. Yes, she said. Something moved across his face. Felix? Sal told me you knew, about 10 minutes ago. He absorbed that. Sal Marin. He said the name slowly, the way you say the name of something you've been looking at wrong for a long time. Sal's been... how long? That's not what we're talking about right now. The hell it isn't. His voice sharpened. Not loud. Adrian rarely got loud. That wasn't how his anger worked. It worked inward. It compressed. But the edge in it was real. You've had Sal feeding you. Sal has been telling me things I needed to know to do my job, she said, for 6 years. And I used exactly none of it against you. Not once. She held his gaze. You can verify that. I can't verify anything right now. That's the problem. He pulled one hand out of his pocket and pressed it against the back of his neck and looked at the driveway for a moment. Why did you call Moore? Because he's moving into the northern corridor and you didn't know it yet. And if he gets traction there, the organization doesn't have a viable structure left by spring. So you called him, without telling me, without asking me. I asked him to hold his position for 30 days. And what did he ask for? He wants the River District processing terms renegotiated. The volume has changed since the original agreement. Adrian stared at her. The expression on his face was one she recognized. She'd seen it in rooms where information arrived that rearranged everything. The expression of a man whose internal map is being redrawn against his will, line by line. "You negotiated on behalf of this organization," he said slowly, "4 days after you walked out of it. I asked him to wait. I didn't agree to anything. You called him Seraphina. You—" He stopped, looked at the house, the kitchen light, looked back at her. "What were you going to do with the 30 days? She said nothing. "Were you going to come back?" His voice had changed. The edge was still there, but something else had come through it. Something that sounded less like anger and more like the question itself was costing him something. Was that the plan? Buy 30 days, then walk back in like, "I don't have a plan," she said, and it was true. And she could hear that it was true in her own voice, and she thought he could probably hear it too. "I was standing in a grocery store, and Luca Vieri called me and told me Moore was already moving. I called Moore because I understood what it meant, and I acted on that understanding. That's what I've always done." She paused. "It's what you've always relied on me to do." The word relied hit him somewhere. She could see it. He stood in the driveway with his jaw tight and his hand back in his pocket, and she could see him working through the geometry of the situation, the same way she'd worked through it in the car, and she watched him arrive at the same place she had. "Come inside," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he followed her in. She made coffee because it was something to do, and because the ritual of it, the grind, the water, the specific timing, gave the room a function other than confrontation. Adrian sat at the kitchen table without being asked, which was something she noted. He'd been here before, but not often, not regularly, and the fact that he sat without surveying the room first was the behavior of a man who had stopped performing. She set a cup in front of him. He didn't touch it immediately. "Moore has been building toward the north for 8 months, he said. "Felix thinks it started before—" He stopped. "Before the dinner." "Before the dinner," he confirmed quietly. She sat down across from him. "That doesn't surprise me." "It doesn't surprise you," he repeated, and something in his tone changed. "You knew." "I didn't know specifically. I knew Moore had been restless about the River District terms for over a year. I'd been managing it." She kept her voice even. "One of the things I managed consistently." He looked at his coffee. "How many things were you managing that I didn't know about?" The question was honest. She gave it an honest answer. "Enough that it would take me the better part of a day to list them completely." He absorbed that. His hand moved to the coffee cup, and he turned it slightly without picking it up. "Marco came to see me. I figured he would. He said the organization runs on a kind of knowing that can't be transferred. Marco is precise. He asked me what I was going to ask you to come back to." She looked at him. "What did you say?" "I didn't say anything. He left." Adrian looked up from the cup. His eyes were tired in a way that went past sleeplessness into something older, the fatigue of a man who has been running a machine without understanding its engine and has just been shown the engine for the first time. "What would you say if I asked?" She thought about the notebook. "What I will not do." "I'd say it depends on what changed," she said carefully, "between the man who reached across that table and the man sitting in my kitchen. I made a mistake." "That's not what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know how to answer that in a way that doesn't sound like I'm telling you what you want to hear." "Then don't try." She leaned forward slightly. "Adrian, Cassian Moore is in the northern corridor. Gregor Halst's roots are frozen. The Voss property accounts are in a holding pattern. Luca Vieri is getting contact signals from Moore's people and doesn't know who to report to. You have, at best, 4 weeks before the structural damage becomes irreversible." She let that sit for a moment. "What I need to know, what actually matters right now, is whether you understand what happened, not whether you regret it, whether you understand it." He looked at her for a long time across the kitchen table. Then he said something she hadn't expected. "Tell me about Sal." She blinked. "What?" "Sal Marin. Tell me about that arrangement. Everything." His voice was measured, but there was something underneath it. The specific texture of a person who has just realized that the picture they've been looking at has more in it than they thought, and they need to see all of it before they can process anything else. "I need to understand the full shape of what I didn't know." Something in Seraphina's chest went very still, because the question was reasonable. Because in his position, she would have asked the same thing. Because an honest accounting of the organization's information structure was, objectively, what he needed to make any of the decisions in front of him. And because there was one piece of the Salmaran arrangement that she had not thought through in the 3 days since she'd walked out of that dining room, that she was now sitting across from Adrian in her own kitchen with her coffee going warm between her hands, beginning to think through for the first time. Sal has been passing me operational intelligence, she said. Low level, movement reports, processing status, the kind of internal information that helped me stay ahead of problems before they became problems. In exchange for what? She held his gaze. His arrangement with the Bolano logistics family, in the South. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a thing landing. Adrian's expression did not change. His face was very still. His hand, which had been turning the coffee cup, stopped moving. He looked at her across the table with an expression she had seen on his face maybe twice in 15 years, and it was the expression that meant he was working very hard to not let the surface show what was happening underneath. Sal Marin, he said with terrible quietness, has been running a parallel arrangement with a Southern family. Yes. And you knew. Yes. For 6 years. Yes. He stood up. Not violently, not the way a man stands up when he's about to do something with the standing, but the way a man stands up when sitting has become physically impossible, when the body insists on vertical as a function of what the mind is doing. He walked 3 steps toward the window and stopped and stood with his back to her, and she watched the set of his shoulders and thought about what was moving through him right now and let him have the 30 seconds it took. The Bolano family, he said to the window. Yes. Who are directly competitive with the Eastern Corridor routes. In a limited capacity, Sal managed it carefully. It never cost us. It never cost us that you knew of. He turned. His face had rearranged itself into something more controlled, but the control was visible now, where it usually wasn't. She could see the work of it. What else? Adrian, what else did you know that I didn't? She looked at him. I need you to think carefully about how you're asking that question. I'm asking it the only way I know how to ask it. You're asking it like I was managing a parallel operation. I wasn't. I was managing the organization, your organization. The things I knew and didn't tell you were things I'd assessed as lower risk than the alternative, which was telling you and watching you respond in ways that would have cost us more than staying quiet did. That's not your call. It was always my call, she said, and her voice was steady, and she meant every word. Every capo in that room has made calls like that. The difference is, I made mine in the interest of stability, and I was right, consistently, for 15 years. She paused. The Sal arrangement is the cleanest example. If you'd found out about it 6 years ago, what would you have done? He didn't answer. You would have burned it down, she said. Sal, the arrangement, everything touching it, and you would have been justified. And it would have cost you the Eastern Sector information advantage for at least 2 years, at a time when you could not afford that gap. She stood up now, too, because she was done having this conversation from a seated position. I made a call. It was the right call, and you sitting across from me angry about it does not change that it was the right call. He looked at her for a long moment. You protected Sal Marin, he said, because it served the organization. Yes. And you didn't tell me because you didn't trust my judgment. The word trust sat between them like a third person in the room. I trusted your judgment on most things, she said carefully, on that specific category of thing, situations where your first instinct would be to burn something down that could be managed more carefully. I made independent assessments for 15 years. Yes. He pressed one hand flat against the kitchen counter and looked at it. So the organization I thought I was running was the organization you were running, she said firmly. Nothing I did operated outside your interests. Nothing I protected was in conflict with what we were building. I kept things from you because telling you would have been destructive, not because I had a separate agenda. She moved slightly so she was in his sightline. I need you to be able to hear the difference between those two things. He looked up, and then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. His expression shifted. Not the controlled shift she'd been watching for the past 20 minutes, but something more immediate, more visceral. He answered it without stepping away from her, which told her something about the state he was in. "Felix." She watched his face while Felix Druart talked. She watched it change. The color in it changed first, a drawing inward, a pallor that had nothing to do with temperature. Then his jaw, which had been tense with the particular tension of a confrontation, shifted into something else entirely. The tension of a man receiving information that is reorganizing everything he thought he knew about his current situation. His eyes moved to her face and then away and then back, and in the back and forth of that she read something that made her own pulse tick upward. "When?" he said into the phone. He listened. "How many people know?" He listened again. "Don't move on anything. I'll call you back in 10 minutes. He ended the call. He stood very still. "Adrian." Her voice was careful. He looked at her, and in his expression was something she had genuinely never seen there before. In 15 years of reading that face across tables and through crises, and through every variety of pressure their shared history had produced. It was the expression of a man who has just been told that the floor is somewhere other than where he thought it was, and he is now in the process of falling. "Celeste," he said. Seraphina went still. "What about Celeste?" "She made a call." He set the phone down on the counter. His hand was not entirely steady. 3 days ago, the morning after the dinner. He stopped, seemed to be working through how to assemble the sentence. "She called Cassian Moore." The kitchen was very quiet. Seraphina heard her own breathing. "Felix just found out," Adrian continued, in the specific flat tone of a man who has moved past shock into the strange, open country beyond it. "The call lasted 40 minutes. Felix's contact inside Moore's operation confirmed it an hour ago." He looked at her. "She called him before you did. 3 days before you did." The shape of everything rearranged itself. Seraphina stood in her own kitchen and felt the architecture of the past 72 hours rebuild itself around a new central fact. The way a room looks different when you move the light source. The same objects, reconfigured completely. Celeste Rowan had called Cassian Moore the morning after the dinner, before the routes froze, before Marco Ferry's visit, before any of the consequences of the dinner had fully materialized. She had called him before any of it, which meant she hadn't called him in reaction to the crisis. She had called him as part of something that predated the crisis. "What did they discuss?" she said, and her own voice sounded strange to her, controlled in the way things sound when you're controlling them deliberately. Felix doesn't have the full content, enough to know she told Moore that the Vosanello internal structure was going to be disrupted, that there was going to be a window. He stopped, looked at the phone on the counter. "She told him there was going to be a window, Seraphina, 3 days ago, the morning after a dinner where she'd been handed a symbol of authority she'd never asked for." Seraphina said, "How long has she known Moore?" Adrian's jaw tightened. "Felix is working on that." "Adrian." She made him look at her. "How long has she known Moore?" He held her gaze. "Felix thinks possibly from before. Possibly from before me." The word "before" took a moment to land fully. Before Adrian. Which meant Celeste Rowan had not arrived in Adrian Vosanello's life as a companion who had later, opportunistically, made a contact. She had arrived with the contact already in place. She had arrived possibly because of the contact. She had positioned herself beside the most powerful man in the organization's inner circle, waited 8 months, and on the night when Adrian publicly restructured the organization's authority, on the night when Seraphina walked out and the capos didn't raise their glasses, and the first crack appeared in the foundation, she had picked up her phone and called the man best positioned to walk through that crack. Seraphina sat down, not from weakness, from the need to think, and thinking required stillness, and standing required energy she wanted to redirect. Adrian didn't sit. He stayed at the counter with his hand flat against it and watched her with the expression of a man who is waiting for someone he trusts to tell him what the shape of the thing is, because his own capacity to see it clearly has been compromised by the fact that it involves a woman sleeping in his house. "She's been feeding more intelligence on the organization," Seraphina said. Not a question, working through it out loud, because the fastest way to find the holes in a theory was to say it in the presence of someone who would push back if it was wrong. For how long, we don't know yet. She positioned herself close to you, which gave her access to your schedule, your meeting patterns, possibly your conversations. I'm careful about what I say around her. You're careful about the things you know to be careful about. She looked at him. What about the things you didn't think mattered? The routine things. The names you mention casually, the meetings you reference, the patterns of who calls you when. His expression shifted. The night of the dinner, she continued. She was there for the entire evening. She heard every name at that table, watched every interaction, saw exactly how the capos responded to what you did. She paused. And the next morning, she called Moore and told him there was going to be a window. She used me. His voice was very flat. She used the situation you created. Seraphina looked at him steadily. You made it easy by giving her a seat at the table before she'd earned one. He flinched, the smallest movement barely visible, but she'd spent 15 years reading small movements on that face. Where is she now? At the estate, presumably. Felix said she was in her room when he left. He doesn't think she knows he's been... He stopped. I need to go back. Not yet. Seraphina, not yet. Her voice was firm. If you go back now and confront her without a complete picture, she controls the information. She decides what you know and what you don't. You need everything Felix can get you in the next hour before you walk through that door. He stared at her. And you need to think, she said, very carefully, about what it means that Moore already has 3 days of intelligence on the internal situation, including the capos' response to the dinner, including the root freeze, possibly including your conversation with Marco, and he has been letting that intelligence sit while he waits. Adrian's eyes narrowed. He's waiting for something. He called you before I did, she said. Think about that. He's been collecting information for at least 8 months through a source inside your household. He moved his people into the northern corridor as soon as the window opened, and then he answered my call and agreed to wait 30 days. She paused. Why would he agree to wait? The question settled over the kitchen. Adrian worked through it. She could watch him work. The particular quality of his focus when he was actually thinking rather than reacting, which was a quality she had always respected about him when he wasn't letting his pride override it. Because he already has what he needs. Or, she said, because 30 days gives him something better than the northern corridor. What's better than the northern corridor? She looked at him across the table, across the coffee cups, across the 15 years and the dinner, and the crystal glass, and everything that had happened in the driveway 20 minutes ago. Me, she said, in play, without your backing, without organizational standing, making independent calls to your rivals. She let that sit. Think about how that looks from the outside, Adrian. Think about what Moore could do with the fact that Seraphina Vale called him directly 3 days after leaving the Vosanello organization and asked him to hold his position. The color in Adrian's face did something complicated. He could tell every remaining ally we have, he said slowly, that you flipped. He could tell them I'm working with him. He could tell them I orchestrated this from inside, that the walkout was planned, that the root freeze was coordinated, that everything that's happened in the last 4 days has been a managed operation to position him for a takeover. She paused. And given that I did in fact independently call him, given that Sal Marin has been feeding me intelligence for 6 years, given that there are things I managed without telling you, how much of that would be difficult to believe? Adrian looked at her as though he was seeing her from a new angle, and she could not tell, for the first time in 15 years, whether what she saw in his face was understanding or suspicion. Is that what this is? He said, very quietly. The question was almost gentle. That was the worst version of it. The quiet version, the almost gentle version, the version that meant he was asking from a place of genuine uncertainty rather than accusation. No, she said. But you can see why. I can see exactly why, she said. Which is why Moore agreed to wait, because whether it's true or not, the story is now available, and in this business, a story that's available is a story that will be told. Her phone buzzed on the table between them. They both looked at it. The name on the screen was Luca Vieri. She looked at Adrian. He looked at the phone. She picked it up. Luca. His voice was tight and fast, and she had never heard Luca Vieri sound like this. Not in 2 years, not once. There are two of Moore's men at the northern processing point. They came in an hour ago. They're not being aggressive. They're just there, standing, with coffees. But Seraphina, my people are looking at me, and I don't know what to tell them. I don't know who I'm reporting to right now. And if I don't give them an answer in the next 30 minutes, hold your position, she said. Don't engage. Don't ask them to leave. Call me back in 30 minutes. She ended the call. She put the phone down. She looked at Adrian, and Adrian looked at her, and the kitchen was so quiet she could hear the refrigerator. And she thought about 30 days and 30 minutes and the specific feeling of a situation that is compressed from weeks into something much smaller, much more immediate. The feeling of time becoming a different kind of pressure. Tell me what you need, Adrian said. 3 words, delivered without qualification, without negotiation, without the scaffolding of his pride around them. Just the words, clean and direct, the first honest thing she'd heard from him in longer than 4 days. She thought about Celeste Rowan in her pale blue robe. She thought about 40 minutes on a phone call with Cassian Moore. She thought about 8 months of access to the most private rhythms of Adrian Vocinello's life, curated and transmitted and used. She thought about the fact that somewhere inside the estate, right now, Celeste might be making another call. I need to go in with you, she said. He went very still. Not the way it was, she said immediately, before he could construct the wrong version of it. Not a return. Not a reinstatement. I go in with you tonight. We handle Celeste. We get Felix's full picture. And we contain what Moore has access to before he decides the 30 days aren't worth the wait. She held his gaze. After that, we talk about everything else. The structure, the authority, what this organization looks like going forward. All of it. She paused. But tonight, I need to be in that building. He looked at her for a long moment. And you trust me enough, he said, to walk back into that house after what I did. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair where she'd draped it when she came in from the car. I don't need to trust you to make a smart decision, she said. She walked past him toward the door, and he followed her, and she turned off the kitchen light as she left. And the house went dark behind them, and outside the January cold received them both with the same indifference it had shown her the night she'd walked away, as though the temperature had no opinion about the direction you were moving, only about the fact that you were moving at all. She got into his car. He got behind the wheel. Neither of them spoke on the drive back toward the estate, and the silence between them was not comfortable, but it was functional. The silence of two people who understand that words right now are less useful than what comes next. And what comes next requires everything they have, and what they have is, at best, fragile, and at worst, already in someone else's hands. The estate looked different at night when you were returning to it instead of leaving it. Seraphina had left through the front entrance 4 days ago with her coat over her arm and 23 men's silence at her back. She came back through the side entrance, the one that accessed the estate through the kitchen corridor. Adrian's choice, not hers, made without explanation, and she understood the explanation without needing it. He wasn't ready to walk her through the front door. Not yet. Possibly not tonight. That was fine. She wasn't here for the symbolism. She was here for the work. Felix Druart was waiting in the kitchen corridor, and the look on his face when he saw her was a compressed thing. Relief, and something more complicated. A quality of a man who has been holding too much information in too small a container and has just been handed someone to give it to. He was 53 and looked older tonight, the overhead light in the corridor doing nothing to soften the exhaustion around his eyes. Talk, Adrian said. Felix looked between them once, and Seraphina gave him nothing back. Just presence. Just the quality of attention that she'd spent 15 years deploying in rooms where information was being distributed. And he oriented toward Adrian and began. Celeste made 4 calls to Moore's direct number over the past 8 months. The first was in May, 2 months after she and you... He paused. 2 months in. The content of the first 3 calls Felix's contact couldn't get full detail on. The 4th call, the one from Thursday morning, lasted 43 minutes. The contact got partial content. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket, handwritten, which Seraphina noted as the right instinct, and held it without unfolding it. She told more about the dinner before it happened. The corridor went very still. She told him what you were planning to do, Felix continued, looking at Adrian, before you did it. Not the specific gesture, the glass, but the restructuring, the displacement of Seraphina's role. She told him the organization was about to show an internal fracture at the leadership level and that it would create an access window in the north. Seraphina heard Adrian breathe out slowly through his nose. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Felix. How did she know? She said. She was in the room, Adrian said from somewhere slightly behind her left shoulder, his voice controlled in the way things are controlled when the control is close to its limit. 3 weeks ago, I was working through the decision. I talked through some of it in the bedroom. I thought... He stopped. You thought she was asleep, Felix said carefully. Silence. There's more, Felix said. He finally unfolded the paper. Moore's contact in the northern sector, the one who's been making approaches to Luca Vieri's people. His name is Dren Vasi. He arrived in the city 11 months ago. He paused. He arrived 11 months ago on a business reference from a property management contact. The reference was arranged through Elena Voss's husband's company. Seraphina went still in a way that was different from the previous stillness. The Voss company, she said. Yes. Dren Vasi was placed in this city through a channel that runs adjacent to the Vossanello organizational structure, she said, working it out as she spoke, because speaking it was the fastest way to hear where it broke. 11 months ago, which is 3 months before Celeste arrived. She turned and looked at Adrian. He was looking at the wall. She didn't find you, Seraphina said. Not gently, because there was no version of this that was gentle. You were found. The word landed in the corridor and stayed there, and the three of them stood in its company for a moment that was neither short nor long but had the specific weight of a moment that will be referenced later. That will be the moment people mean when they say, when we understood what we were actually dealing with. Adrian's face was doing something she had never seen it do. Not anger. Past the place where anger lives into somewhere colder and more fundamental. The expression of a man confronting the specific variety of humiliation that comes from being used through the thing you are most certain about in yourself. Where is she? He said. Her room, Felix said, as of 20 minutes ago. And she doesn't know Felix has... No. Adrian moved toward the corridor that led to the main house. Seraphina caught his arm, her hand on his forearm, fingers around the sleeve of his coat, and she felt the tension in the muscle beneath the fabric, and held on anyway. Not like this, she said. He looked at her hand, then at her face. Let go. Not like this, Adrian. If you walk in there angry, she tells you nothing, and then she calls Moore from the car on the way out, and you've got nothing except confirmation of something you can't prove. She held his gaze. You need her to not know what you know, for as long as possible. He held the eye contact for 3 full seconds, which was the longest 3 seconds she'd spent in recent memory, and then something in his jaw released by 1 degree. Not agreement, not yet, but the small internal concession that meant he was listening. What do you want to do? He said. I want to talk to her, Seraphina said. Alone. Felix made a small involuntary sound. Adrian looked at her like she'd said something in a language he almost spoke. You want to... She doesn't know I'm here. She doesn't know what Felix has. If you walk in, she defends. If I walk in... She paused. She thinks I'm gone. She thinks the situation is settled in her direction. Let her think that for another 10 minutes. And if she calls more while you're... Then we know where we stand, but she won't. Seraphina released his arm. She'll want to know what I want first. She's too careful not to. Adrian looked at her for another moment. His face was still doing the thing she couldn't fully read, the complicated thing that was part anger and part something raw. Then he looked at Felix. Pull everything Moore's man has sent in the last 72 hours. Everything. I want it on paper before the hour's out. Felix nodded and moved. Adrian looked back at Seraphina. 10 minutes, he said. She left him in the corridor. Mas. The room Celeste had been using was on the 2nd floor, East Wing, the room that had historically been used for guests of a particular standing. Not the most significant guest room, which was reserved for the kind of visit that required its own implied hierarchy, but the second best, which communicated importance without supremacy. Seraphina had chosen it for her months ago, in the week when the question of where Celeste would stay had been a logistical matter rather than a loaded one. She had chosen it carefully, the way she chose everything, and now she walked down the corridor toward it and noted the irony of that without letting it slow her. She knocked twice. A pause. Then Celeste's voice, carefully neutral. "Come in." She was sitting in the chair by the window, which was not where Seraphina would have expected to find her. In bed, or at the desk, or performing some ordinary evening routine. She was sitting in the chair in the specific posture of a person who has been sitting very still for a while, waiting for something. Her hair was down and she was wearing clothes rather than the silk robe, which meant she had not been preparing to sleep. She was fully dressed and fully awake, and her eyes, when they found Seraphina in the doorway, went through a sequence of expressions so fast that most people would have missed them. Seraphina was not most people. The sequence was surprise, assessment, decision, all in under 2 seconds. Then the expression settled into something that was performing calm. "Seraphina," she said. No inflection, no welcome, not hostile, just the name, deployed as a kind of space holder while she finished deciding what this visit meant. Seraphina stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She did not sit. She stood about 6 feet from Celeste with her coat still on, because this was not a visit she intended to make comfortable, and taking off a coat was the universal signal of a person who intends to stay. "You've been expecting something," Seraphina said. Celeste looked at her steadily. "Have I?" "You're dressed. It's 10:30. You're sitting in that chair like you've been in it for an hour." Seraphina looked at her without any particular intensity. Not the interrogation look, not the threat look, just the look of a person reading a room with the lights on. "What were you expecting?" "Adrian," Celeste said after a moment, calmly. "He's downstairs." "I know." "You know he came to see me tonight." A flicker. Barely there. The tiny, involuntary adjustment of a person recalibrating. "Did he?" "Yes." Seraphina moved slightly, not toward her, just a reorientation, giving the room different geometry. "He came to talk about more, about the northern situation." Celeste said nothing. Her hands were in her lap and they were still. "And then some other things came up," Seraphina continued, her voice the same even register it had been since she walked in. Not warm, not threatening, just factual, the tone of a person delivering information. "About the morning after the dinner. About a phone call." Celeste's hands, in her lap, shifted. The left one moved over the right. A micro gesture, the kind the body makes when it's attempting to contain something the mind is telling it to contain. "What phone call?" Celeste said. And there it was. Not the denial Seraphina had expected, the immediate dismissal, the performance of confusion. What she got instead was a question that was precisely calibrated to give away nothing while gathering information, and that calibration was the tell. An innocent person says, "I don't know what you mean." A careful person says, "What phone call?" Because a careful person knows there might be more than one, and they need to know which one you have. Seraphina looked at her. Celeste looked back. And something in the room changed. A drop in the pretense, a clearing, the way a fog lifts not all at once but in sections, revealing the actual landscape underneath. "How long have you known Cassian Moore?" Seraphina said. Celeste was quiet for 4 seconds. Seraphina counted them. Then, "You didn't come up here to ask me questions you already have the answers to." "No," Seraphina agreed. "I came up here to give you an opportunity." "To do what?" "To tell me something I don't already know." She held Celeste's gaze. "Because right now, what I have is the shape of a plan, the architecture. What I don't have are the details you filled in. And some of those details, depending on what they are, change what happens next in ways that might matter to you." Celeste looked at her for a long moment. Outside the window, the estate grounds were dark, the January night pressing flat against the glass. She looked like she was making a calculation that she had been preparing to make for a long time and was now actually making. "He was going to take the north anyway," Celeste said finally. Her voice was different now. not the performing calm voice, something lower and more direct, with or without me. The root freeze, the capo situation, he read all of that on his own. I didn't create the window. The window was already there. You told him when to step through it. I told him when the visibility was best. A pause. There's a difference. Not to the people in the northern corridor. Celeste looked away, toward the window. Her profile was composed and her hands had stilled again in her lap. What do you want to know? Everything you gave him. Every detail, every timeline, every piece of operational information that went from this house to Moore's people in the past 8 months. Seraphina kept her voice level. And I want to know what he promised you. The last question landed differently. Seraphina watched it land. Watched something move across Celeste's face that wasn't calculation, wasn't performance, was something more unguarded than either. It was the expression of a person who has been asked the question that actually matters, and is surprised to find that the surprise hurts. A way out, Celeste said, quietly. The room was very still. Of what? Seraphina said. Celeste looked at her hands. This. All of this. A breath. You think I wanted to be here? You think I wanted to be handed a glass in front of 23 men and told to be the symbol of something I don't understand? Her voice stayed controlled, but the edges of it were fraying, the way fabric frays when it's been under tension for too long. I didn't ask for any of this. Adrian decided what I was going to be, and I was supposed to fit the shape he cut for me. And Moore offered you a different shape. Moore offered me a plane ticket and enough money to disappear somewhere that this whole world doesn't exist. Her eyes came back to Seraphina. That's what I wanted. That's all I ever wanted. I didn't want territory or authority or any of the things that apparently matter so much in that dining room. Seraphina looked at her for a long moment. She thought about what it would have cost to be Celeste, 29 years old, handed a crystal glass in front of a room full of men whose names she barely knew, given a title that carried weight she hadn't earned and couldn't yet understand, placed at the center of a structure that expected things from her she'd never been prepared for. She thought about what it would feel like to be used as an instrument of someone else's image, and she thought about how different that was from what had been done to her, because what had been done to her was the removal of something she'd built, and what had been done to Celeste was the imposition of something she'd never asked to carry. She did not feel sympathy, but she felt the shape of it. Where is Moore's man? She said. Vasi, where is he right now? Celeste blinked. The shift in subject had caught her. The northern processing point. Luca Vieri's sector. And Moore, when does he expect to hear from you? A pause. Midnight. Seraphina looked at the clock on the wall. It was 10:47. You're going to call him, she said, at midnight, and you're going to tell him the situation inside the organization is more unstable than he thinks. That Adrian is losing control of the capo structure faster than projected. That the moment to move is now, not in 30 days. Celeste stared at her. Why would I? Because, Seraphina said, if Moore moves tonight, I know exactly where he'll move, and I can contain it. If he waits 30 days, I don't know his approach, and neither does anyone else. She paused. You call him at midnight and tell him to move now, and I make sure that when this is over, you get what he promised you. The exit, the money, all of it. From me, not from him. Which means it actually happens, and it doesn't come with strings he forgot to mention. Celeste was very still. You'd do that. I need more in the open. You need out. Those aren't incompatible. Seraphina held her gaze. But I need the call to happen at midnight, and I need you to say exactly what I tell you to say. A long silence. Then Celeste said, What about Adrian? What about him? He's going to... When he finds out, leave Adrian to me, Seraphina said. Celeste looked at her for another moment with an expression that Seraphina could not fully categorize. Something between wariness and the specific exhaustion of a person who has been performing a version of themselves for 8 months and has just been given permission to stop. Then she nodded. Once. Seraphina left the room and went downstairs and found Adrian in the study with Felix, a table covered in handwritten notes between them, and she told him what she needed. He looked at her for 10 full seconds without speaking. Then he said, "You're going to let Moore think he has an opening. I'm going to give him the opening I want him to walk through. And Celeste is done. She wants out, and she's going to earn it by being useful tonight." She looked at him steadily. "That's the only play that gets Moore's man out of the northern corridor before Luca's people do something irreversible." Adrian looked at the table, at the notes, at his own hands, then at Felix. "Can we have people at the northern processing point in—" He checked his watch. 60 minutes. 45, Felix said. "Do it." He looked back at Seraphina. "If this doesn't work, then we're in the same position we'd be in if we did nothing, except we've lost 45 minutes. She picked up one of Felix's handwritten pages and looked at the numbers on it. "It'll work." "How do you know?" "Because Moore is going to be so focused on the opening in the north that he's not going to be thinking about why it opened so conveniently." She set the page down. "And because I know how Moore thinks. I spent 6 weeks negotiating with him 8 years ago. He moves fast when he thinks he has information advantage. He's going to move fast tonight, and fast is sloppy, and sloppy is what we need." Adrian was quiet. She looked at him. "Do you trust me?" The question hung in the study between them, heavy, not rhetorical, carrying the full weight of the previous 4 days and everything in them, the dinner and the driveway and the kitchen and Salmarin and everything she'd managed and everything she hadn't told him, and everything that was still unresolved and might stay unresolved for a long time. He met her eyes. "Yes," he said. "Yes." At midnight exactly, Celeste called Moore. Seraphina stood outside the room and listened through the door, which was open by 3 inches, and she could hear Celeste's voice, steady, controlled, doing what she'd been told to do. And she could hear the silence on the other end that meant Moore was processing, and then his voice, too low to catch the words, but the cadence of it recognizable, the cadence of a man accelerating a plan. The call lasted 7 minutes. When it ended, Seraphina pushed the door open, and Celeste looked at her with the expression of a person who has just jumped from something and is now waiting to find out what the landing feels like. "He's moving Vasi tonight," Celeste said. "I know." Seraphina's phone was already in her hand. She sent a single text to Felix. "Now." 38 minutes earlier, Felix had placed 4 men at the northern processing point. Not aggressive, not visible, positioned in the specific way that Seraphina had described to him from memory, from the knowledge of that facility's layout that she carried in her head from a site visit 3 years ago. 2 at the service entrance, 2 on the access road that Vasi's approach would require. Not an ambush, a presence. The message of a presence, which was, "We knew you were coming." That message, delivered to Vasi in the form of 4 men who were simply there when he arrived, would be the message Moore received within the hour. And Moore receiving the message that his approach had been anticipated, not blocked, not countered with force, but simply known, was more damaging to his position than any direct confrontation would have been. It told him that his intelligence was compromised. It told him that whatever source he'd been running inside the Vosanello structure had just been turned against him. It told him that the opening he'd moved toward was not an opening. It was a door that someone had decided to let him walk toward so they could watch him do it. Seraphina put the phone in her pocket and looked at Celeste. "Pack what you need tonight. Felix will have a car for you in the morning." Celeste looked at her. Something moved across her face. Not gratitude exactly, more like the expression of a person confronting the fact that the person helping them had less reason to help them than almost anyone else in the building. "Why?" "Because you were used," Seraphina said, "and because being used is not the same as being guilty." She paused. "And because I said I would." She left the room. She went downstairs and found Adrian in the study still, standing at the window this time, and when she came in he turned and looked at her and she said, "Vasi's going to hit a wall in about 20 minutes. Moore will know inside the hour that his approach was anticipated." Adrian nodded slowly. "He'll pull back," she continued. "He won't move again without better intelligence, and his intelligence source is on her way out tomorrow morning." She looked at Adrian. That buys us the time we need, not for everything, but for the conversation we need to have before we can do anything else. He looked at her. What conversation? She looked back at him. The study was quiet around them. The estate quiet. The estate that had been 61 years of accumulated power and its discontents. The estate with the marble floors and the chandeliers and the long table in the dining room where 23 glasses had sat untouched 5 nights ago. She thought about all the time she'd been in this room, in this building, in the architecture of an organization she'd spent 15 years holding together from the inside, and she thought about what she wanted, specifically, for the first time in 15 years, in a way that was entirely separate from what the organization needed. Then her phone buzzed. Felix. One word. Vasi's retreating. And then 30 seconds later, a second message from a number she didn't expect. Cassian Moore's number. No words. Just a contact card. Forwarded. A name she didn't recognize. She stared at it. She stared at it for long enough that Adrian noticed. What? He said. She held up the phone. He crossed the room and looked at the screen and then looked at her, and she saw in his face the same thing she was feeling, the same recognition of a thing that had just changed the shape of everything again, because the contact card Cassian Moore had just sent her was not a threat, and not an olive branch, and not a negotiating gesture. It was a name she recognized, a name that belonged to someone in this building, someone who was not Celeste Rowan. Someone who had been in this building for much longer than 8 months, whose presence had never once triggered the suspicion of anyone in the organization because their access had always seemed earned, always seemed legitimate, had always seemed like exactly what it appeared to be. And now, with Moore's retreat, with his intelligence source burned, with the Northern play collapsed before it landed, he had sent her this name as the only card he had left to play, the last piece of leverage in a hand that had just gone cold. The name on the screen was Felix Druart, and somewhere in the estate, 40 feet down the corridor and around a corner, Felix Druart's footsteps were moving toward them. Seraphina put the phone in her pocket. She did it slowly, deliberately, the way you move when the most important thing you can do in a given moment is not move too fast. Adrian was watching her face, and she could feel him reading it the same way she read his. The 15 years of shared language between two people who have spent enough time in the same rooms to have developed an entire vocabulary of small movements and their meanings. She let him read what was there, which was not panic and not uncertainty, but a kind of absolute stillness that she knew from the inside was the stillness that comes just before a decision completes itself. Felix's footsteps were in the corridor, 30 feet, 25. The particular rhythm of a man walking at his normal pace, which meant he did not yet know that the situation had changed. She looked at Adrian and she said, with her voice very low and very level, "Don't." He looked at her. "Let me talk to him." "Seraphina, I know what I'm doing." She held his gaze for 1 second, 2, and then she turned and walked to the study door and opened it before Felix could knock. And she stepped into the corridor and pulled the door mostly closed behind her, and she stood in the hallway with Felix Druart and looked at him in the overhead light and watched his face do the thing faces do when they realize the conversation they are about to have is not the one they were expecting. He stopped. He was carrying a folder, certas papers, more handwritten notes, the kind of operational detail he'd been compiling for the past hour. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is trying to determine in real time how much of what he's seen he should respond to. "Moore sent me a name," she said. Felix's face did not move. That was the tell. An innocent man's face moves. An innocent man says what name, or what does that mean, or produces some variety of the reflexive confusion that is the genuine response to unexpected information. Felix Druart's face stayed exactly where it was, controlled and unreadable, and in that stillness was everything she needed to know. She watched him make the decision. She could see it happening. The internal calculation, the assessment of options, the specific compression of a person who has been running a long game and has just arrived at the moment where the game is over, and the only remaining question is what shape the ending takes. He said, "How long have you known?" "I didn't," she said, "until 30 seconds ago." Something shifted in his face. Not relief, more like the grim recognition of a man who understands that his exposure came from a direction he hadn't fully accounted for. Moore gave me up. His play collapsed. You were the last card he had. Felix looked at the folder in his hands. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they're holding when their hands need something to do while their mind processes a rapid and unwelcome reorganization of everything. How much does Adrian know? He knows the name. Then there's no version of this where he stopped, let out a breath that was slow and controlled, and she recognized it as the breath of a man accepting a reality he'd been holding at a distance for however long this had been running. How long have you been working with Moore? She said. I haven't been working with him. He looked up. His voice was direct, and she could tell it was the most honest he'd been in a long time. The specific directness of a man who has moved past the point where maintaining the story costs anything useful. I've been providing information, operational patterns, timing, structural details. I didn't direct anything. I didn't facilitate any moves against the organization. You gave him the timing on the capo dinner. A pause. Yes. You told him when Adrian was planning the restructuring. I told him there was going to be a shift in the internal authority structure. I didn't know the specifics. I didn't know about the... He paused. The glass. She looked at him steadily. Why? He was quiet for a moment. The folder was still in his hands. His eyes moved to the study door, the sliver of light from the gap she'd left, and then back to her. And she could see him weighing what he was about to say against everything else he might say instead, and then deciding that the truth was, at this point, the only thing with any value remaining. 19 years, he said. 19 years I ran operations for this organization. I built the processing infrastructure from 6 fronts to 11. I restructured the authorization chain after the collapse in the 3rd year when the whole Eastern network was exposed, and I rebuilt it in 4 months, and nobody lost anything significant. I have given this organization 19 years. His voice stayed level, but something in it was tight the way a wire is tight, under tension, carrying load. Adrian has never once said my name in a room where it mattered, never once put me in front of the people whose operations I was running. For 19 years I have been the mechanism that made the machine function, and the machine has never once acknowledged the mechanism existed. She heard it for what it was, and she heard it the way you hear something that is true even when it comes from a place that used to the truth badly. So you went to Moore. Moore approached me 14 months ago. He knew my work. He knew it better than Adrian did, which should tell you something. A beat. He offered me recognition, a position in his structure that was commensurate with what I actually did, rather than what I was allowed to appear to do. And the information you gave him was supposed to be enough to position him for an eventual negotiation, not a takeover, a leverage play, the kind that ends in new terms, restructured agreements. He stopped again. I didn't know about Celeste. I didn't know he'd recruited her separately. I didn't know he was planning a full territorial move on the north. What I thought I was contributing to and what I was actually contributing to were not the same thing. He used you, she said. Everyone uses everyone in this business. His voice was flat. You know that better than anyone. The corridor was quiet. She could hear the estate around them, the building's particular silence at this hour, the specific weight of a structure that has been holding the accumulated pressure of many years and many decisions and is still, somehow, standing. She thought about 19 years. She thought about the specific, grinding, invisible exhaustion of being the person who makes the machine work without the machine ever looking back at you. She understood it in the way she understood things that lived in her own body. The early years when she was 29 and doing necessary work that the organization did not know how to name. The years of being present and essential and unacknowledged. The years before she had built enough structural weight into her own presence that the acknowledgement became implicit rather than expressed. Felix had never gotten there. She did not forgive him for what he'd done. Forgiveness was not a category that applied cleanly here, but she understood the architecture of it in a way that mattered for what she decided next. Give me the folder, she said. He looked at her. Then he held it out. She took it. Go to the kitchen, she said. Wait there. Don't call anyone. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. Not gratitude, not relief, something more like the stunned quality of a person who expected one outcome and received something they don't yet have a name for. Then he walked past her toward the corridor that led to the kitchen, and she listened to his footsteps until they turned the corner and became inaudible. She stood in the hallway alone for a moment. Then she pushed the study door open and went back inside. Adrian was standing exactly where she'd left him, which told her he hadn't moved toward the door once in the time she'd been in the corridor, which told her something about the degree to which he had trusted her when she said, "Let me talk to him." She put the folder on the desk between them and looked at him and told him everything Felix had said clearly and completely, in the order it had been said. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, long enough that she didn't try to fill it. She had learned over 15 years when Adrian's silences were processing and when they were anger-contained and when they were something else entirely, and this one was the first kind, the kind that required room. Finally, he said, 19 years. Yes. And I never... He stopped, pressed his hand against the back of his neck. Did you know that he felt... I knew he was under-acknowledged, she said carefully. I didn't know he'd taken it this far. A pause. That's one I missed. He looked at her. The expression on his face when she said that, one I missed, was something she hadn't expected, a quality of recognition that was also somewhere underneath it, a kind of relief, as though her acknowledging the miss made the situation more real in a way that was painful but necessary. What do we do with him? Adrian said. He stays. Modified access. No external communications without oversight for the foreseeable future. His infrastructure knowledge is too embedded in the processing chain to lose cleanly, and replacing him right now in the middle of everything else creates a gap that's worse than the risk he represents. She looked at him steadily. More burned him. He has no remaining channel and nothing to offer anyone. He's not a continuing threat. He's a man who made a bad calculation and is going to spend the next several years earning back what he lost. You're very clinical about this. I'm practical, she said. There's a difference. And more. She opened the folder, looked at the papers inside. Moore's play failed. His northern approach was anticipated. His source inside the household is leaving in the morning. His other source just had a conversation with me that he knows Moore will interpret as a defection. He has nothing. She looked up. He'll call me in the next 48 hours and ask to renegotiate the River District terms, properly this time, through a proper channel. And you'll negotiate. I'll listen to what he proposes. The original terms genuinely don't reflect current volumes. He's not wrong about that. A renegotiation that stabilizes the South gives us certainty on that border that we've been managing rather than actually securing for 8 years. She paused. It's worth doing. Adrian looked at her across the desk, across the folder, across everything that the last 5 days had deposited between them. You're talking about this like you're already back, he said. Carefully. Not an accusation. She looked at him. I'm talking about it like someone who understands the situation and is telling you what I see. What you do with it is your decision. Is it? He held her gaze. Because from where I'm standing, the decision that actually matters has already been made. By you. In the last 4 hours. He moved around the desk, not toward her exactly, but changing the geometry of the room in the way people do when they need distance not to feel like a verdict. You came back into this building. You managed Celeste. You handled Felix. You set the northern response. He stopped. When did you decide? She thought about the grocery store. The strawberries she'd put back, the squash and the kale she'd kept, the drive home, and the call to Moore and the headlights in her driveway. I'm not sure I decided, she said. I think the situation kept requiring the next thing, and I kept doing the next thing, and at some point the accumulation of next things became a direction. He almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile. Too much had happened too recently for a full smile, to be honest. But the corner of his mouth moved in a way that she recognized from years of watching his face in rooms where there wasn't much to smile about. That's not an answer, he said. It's the true one. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the folder on the desk and the handwritten notes, and the particular disarray of a study that had been the center of a crisis for the past several hours. "I need to say something," he said. She waited. "What I did at that dinner." He said it looking at the desk rather than at her, which she recognized not as cowardice but as the specific difficulty of a man who is doing something he has very little practice at. "I told myself it was about the organization, about signaling a new direction, about—" He stopped. "It wasn't. It was about the fact that everyone in that room looked at you the way they looked at you, and I had been sitting next to that for 15 years, and I had—" Another stop. He looked up. "I made you smaller because your presence made me feel smaller, and I told myself a story about it that made it sound like strategy." The room was very quiet. "I know," she said. "I know you know." He held her gaze. "I'm saying it anyway, because you deserve to hear it said, not just understood." She looked at him for a long moment, at the face she had read 10,000 times across 15 years, at the specific tiredness in it tonight, and the honesty that tiredness had allowed through, and the man underneath the machinery of the role he'd built around himself. Not a good man in any uncomplicated sense, not a man without the capacity for the kind of damage he'd done, but a man who was, in this moment, trying to see clearly without the scaffolding of his own pride holding the view. "I know," she said again, "and I need you to understand something in return." He waited. "I'm not coming back to what it was," she said. "The structure of the last 15 years, where I hold the organization together from a position that everyone feels but nobody names, that's done. If I'm here, it's with standing that is explicit and equal and acknowledged in the rooms where it matters, not because I need the recognition for its own sake." She held his gaze. "Because the organization can't afford another version of Felix. It can't afford to keep building its essential functions on people who are invisible and waiting to be seen. That's a structural vulnerability. You've just lived through what it costs." He absorbed that. "Equal standing," he said. "Equal standing. What does that look like?" "It looks like what it is," she said. "Two people who built something together running it together. No performance, no symbolic gestures, no crystal glasses handed to someone who didn't ask for them." She paused. "And no decisions about the organization's direction made in a bedroom while someone pretends to be asleep." He flinched. Small. She let him. "Can you do that?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. A real moment, not the performed consideration of a man who has already decided. A genuine silence in which she could see him measuring himself against the question and finding the measurement uncomfortable and doing it anyway. "I don't know," he said. "I know I want to. I know what I've seen in the last 5 days has—" He looked for the word. "Reorganize things. Inside. What I thought I understood about how this works and why it works and what I was actually—" He stopped. "I don't know if wanting to be different is the same thing as being different." "It's not," she said. "But it's where it starts." He looked at her. "I'll stay through the more negotiation," she said. "I'll stabilize the capo relationships. I'll work with you on the internal structure, the acknowledgement gaps, the Felix problem, the way information flows and who it flows to. That's probably 3 months of real work." She paused. "After that, we reassess, based on what's actually changed rather than what we intended to change." 3 months, he said. 3 months. He nodded, slowly. The nod of a man accepting terms he knows are fair, which is a different quality than the nod of a man accepting terms he intends to renegotiate. She believed the difference. She wasn't certain she was right to believe it, but she had made her decision in the car, in the grocery store, in the driveway, and she was going to follow through on it with the same precision she brought to every other decision she'd made in her professional life, and she would assess the results honestly and adjust accordingly. That was what she knew how to do. She did not stay at the estate that night. She drove herself home at 2 a.m. in her own car, which Adrian had arranged to be brought around from the side entrance, and she drove the 12 minutes in silence with the radio off and the heat on and the January dark on all sides of the vehicle, and she thought about nothing in particular. Let her mind coast, let the thinking quiet, let the body process the long hours of the last 5 days without direction or agenda. The house was dark when she pulled in. She turned on the kitchen light and stood at the counter and looked at the cold kettle and decided against tea for the third night in a row and went to the study instead and opened the notebook and read what she'd written on the first night. What I will not do. She read the list. Then she took a pen and drew a single line through it, not crossing it out in anger or regret, just marking it as historical, as a document that belonged to a particular moment which had now passed, the way you mark a thing that was true and is now complete. She turned to a new page. She wrote, "What comes next?" And then she sat with the pen in her hand and the blank page in front of her and thought about the Northern Corridor and the Moore negotiation and Luca Vieri's people waiting for direction and the 11 processing fronts and Felix Drouart sitting in a kitchen somewhere in the estate trying to understand what version of the future he was still in. She thought about Celeste Rowan, who would be on a car tomorrow morning headed toward whatever exit looked like for a 29-year-old who had spent 8 months being someone else's instrument and had finally, in the last hour of it, managed to be useful on her own terms. She thought about Gregor Halst and his frozen routes and the phone calls she'd need to make in the morning, the particular quality of patience she'd need to bring to that conversation, the exact right register of authority without pressure. She thought about a room full of men who had not raised their glasses. She thought about what it had felt like to walk out of that room, the cold, the marble, the small sound of the door closing, and she thought about what it felt like to walk back in, 4 days later, through the side entrance, with the full weight of everything those 4 days had contained behind her. It did not feel like a return. It felt like something she didn't have a clean word for yet, something that would need time to name itself, the way new things always needed time, the way the apple tree in her garden had needed 4 years before it was substantial enough to prune. She put the pen down on the open notebook without writing anything else. She looked at the blank page. She left it blank. There were some things it was better to not pre-write, some pages that needed to be filled in real time, in the actual company of what was happening, without the foreclosing effect of having already decided what the words would be. She had spent 15 years managing a structure that needed someone who could think fast and decide cleanly and absorb the cost of being right without requiring the credit. That was not something she intended to stop doing. It was part of her in the way things become part of you when you've done them long enough to stop noticing you're doing them, woven into the way she breathed and moved and organized information and read rooms and decided things. What she intended to change was the condition under which she did it. That was not a small change. She understood that clearly. She also understood, with the same precision she brought to every assessment that actually mattered, that the change she described in the study tonight was not something Adrian could simply decide to make and have it be made. It was something that would require tending, the way the apple tree required tending, in every season and in the unglamorous intervals between seasons. In the cold months when there was nothing visible happening and the work was only maintenance and the payoff was somewhere in the future, out of sight. She had built something once out of 15 years of that kind of work. She could build something again. Or she could find in 3 months that what she'd thought was possible wasn't, and she would leave again, cleanly, completely, without the complication of an organization in freefall that made the leaving feel like abandonment. She had bought herself the conditions for a genuine assessment. That was what the last 5 days had actually produced, underneath everything else. Not a resolution, but an honest starting point. She closed the notebook. She went to bed at 2:43 a.m. She set an alarm for 7 because the Halst call needed to happen before 9, and she wanted to be awake enough to make it well. She slept. In the morning, the city was still cold, but the light had changed. January light in the early morning has a particular quality, low and pale and very clear, the kind of clarity that doesn't flatter anything but shows everything accurately, without the softening that comes later in the day when the angle shifts. Seraphina made coffee, real coffee this time, and stood at the kitchen window with the mug in both hands and looked at the apple tree, which was the same bare structure it had been every morning this week, the same winter architecture of branch and absence. She had planted it 4 years ago in the first week of March, when the ground was still half frozen and her neighbor had leaned over the fence and told her it was too early in the season and the tree wouldn't take. She had thanked the neighbor and planted it anyway, and the tree had taken, and 4 years later it produced small, tart apples in September that she used for exactly nothing because she didn't bake, but which she looked at with a specific satisfaction that had nothing to do with utility and everything to do with the fact that she had planted a thing and tended a thing, and the thing had become itself. She thought about what Gregor Holst was going to say when she called. She thought about how she would answer him. She thought about the crystal glass on Adrian's table, which was still there. She had seen it in the study last night, set on the corner of the desk, away from the working papers, the one from the dinner, the one that had been at the center of everything. She didn't know whether Adrian had put it there deliberately or whether it had ended up there through the ordinary movement of objects in a house where significant things had happened. She suspected it didn't matter, and that the distinction between deliberate and incidental was something that would resolve itself over time or wouldn't, along with everything else. She picked up her phone. She called Gregor Holst. He answered on the first ring. He had been expecting her clearly, the ring barely completing itself before his voice was there. And it was different from the last time she'd heard it. The controlled ice-crossing quality was gone, replaced by something more direct. The register of a man who has been waiting for a conversation to become possible and is relieved it finally is. Seraphina, he said. Gregor. The Roots, he said. We'll open today, she said. This afternoon. I need you to process the new authorization chain, which is going to look slightly different from what you were sent last week, and I need you to do it without asking questions about the difference until I can sit down with you properly, which I'd like to do Thursday, if that works. A pause. Then, Thursday works. Good. She paused. I know the last week has been complicated. That's one word for it. His voice carried something she recognized. Not resentment, not exactly, but the residue of it. The particular texture of a man who has been uncertain for 5 days about whether his loyalty to a structure was going to be repaid by the structure surviving. Are you back? She looked at the apple tree. I'm here, she said. That's what I know right now. A pause. Long enough to be genuine. Then, that's enough. He ended the call. She put the phone on the counter and drank her coffee and looked at the bare tree in the January light, and she thought that that's enough was, in fact, the right answer for the moment. Not a large answer, not a final answer, but the accurate one, the one that was true without overpromising, the one that asked the thing to be what it was right now, rather than what it might eventually become. She had spent 15 years building something on promises that she kept. She was going to keep building, not on the same terms, not in the same shape, not with the same invisible weight of a person who held everything together from a position nobody named. She was going to build on ground she had negotiated for herself, in a season that was cold and early and had no visible fruit yet, toward something she couldn't see from here but could feel in the specific way you feel the rightness of a direction when you've spent enough time learning to tell the difference between rightness and convenience. She finished her coffee. She rinsed the mug. She got her coat. She went out into the January morning and got in the car and drove toward everything that came next, and the city received her the way cities receive everyone, without preference, without ceremony, with the same gray and indifferent welcome it extended to all the other people moving through it on ordinary mornings, carrying the weight of what they'd done and what they intended and what they couldn't yet know. The light was low and pale and very clear. She drove into it,